Let me ask you something. What's the most complicated, complex organ in the human body, or the universe for that matter? The brain, right? What I find really interesting about the brain is that, when you think about something like heart disease or kidney or liver or any part of the body, stomach even, if you have a problem with it, generally requires a battery of tests, right? Like you can have a scope put down your stomach. You can get blood tests, run EKGs on your heart, test your kidney function, liver function, blood tests of all sorts. If you have something like a bump on your skin, it has to get a biopsy. And so in order to diagnose the human body, there's a battery of medical tests required to get an accurate assessment of the physiology. What's causing a heart arrhythmia, right? And so, what's causing a disruption in the conduction of, the impulses? What is causing premature ventricular contractions or atrial fibrillation or ventricular fibrillation or chest pain? In order to diagnose the heart, do we just ask you about your father? Say, oh, did your dad have chest pain? What medications is he on? That's a hereditary component. How long you been having chest pain? Okay, great. Well, it sounds to me like we need to schedule you for a quadruple bypass. Or, you know what, your kidney. Yeah, your kidney is acting up. No, you have to get tests, right? Why is it, though, with the human brain, the most complicated of all these organs, the most complicated, we can diagnose the brain chemistry of a person over the telephone? Anybody ever take a biopsy of your brain? They're going to tell you that your brain chemistry is off. Let me tell you about your brain chemistry. What causes addiction? Well, what causes addiction would be the introduction of exogenous substances and then the brain's correcting of the chemical imbalances. Yeah. You overstimulate dopamine and serotonin, you get what's called downregulation. That means that you reduce the sensitivity to dopamine and serotonin to try to normalize the physiology. So your brain's automatically adapting. And then when you think about something like mood disorders, well, what would happen in the opposite if you've been sustained in, say, narcissistic abuse or pervasive anxiety? What causes depression? Is it low serotonin? Or is it a trigger, like saying sadness? Sadness being entrapped within a fight or flight reaction causes the occurrence of there being something wrong with me, causing you to look inward, triggering yourself further. So something's wrong triggers sadness, which triggers something's wrong, and you get stuck in your head. Now, if you're stuck in your head and you're anxious and depressed because of it, you're going to have lower dopamine and serotonin. Well, what's your body going to do? Well, it's going to upregulate the receptors in the same way that it downregulates from sustained elevation. Now, sustained low levels of dopamine and serotonin are going to increase your sensitivity. Then what happens if you have a circumstance change or you have a little epiphany and suddenly you start seeing things as possible? Well, normal serotonin and dopamine is going to cause an elevated mood. We might call that hypomanic. We might call that mania. And so somebody will say, well, you have a mood disorder now, chemical imbalance. And so, is it possible that rather than thinking we've mastered the human mind, we start to pay attention to those of us who say that they escape suffering, saying that they've cured mental illnesses simply by getting out of fight or flight reactions? That if you can't be triggered into feeling broken and not good enough, if you don't sit here and take the behavior of someone else and personalize it, how does it impact your moods? Oh, well, it makes it go away. So is it possible that we just have not really collectively mastered the human mind? Is it possible that all the knowledge in the world does not do anything to transform somebody? Is it possible that people trying to learn through rumination and filling their mind with knowledge is nothing to do with self-awareness at all? That you cannot find yourself outside of yourself? That may be that people just being afraid to look within because of the presence of triggers, causing them to feel broken, avoiding the brokenness, and that the something's wrong is a trigger. And so the very motive to go and see a therapist is the thought that there's something wrong. Have you noticed that when you're triggered, it transforms everything around you? You notice that? When you're at rock bottom, when you look at your past, it's more of the same. Have you noticed that when you're triumphant, the same events of your past are framed as things that made you stronger? That you will recall those traumas and they don't have any impact because you overcame them, you survived them? Is it possible that the fight or flight reaction was a necessary ingredient for the imagination? So that if I was an early human and I was thinking about capturing an animal, the natural occurring fear would guide my thought process to create an accurate plan. And that the imagination is not discerned within the fight or flight mechanism. Is it possible that looking at a past experience that's similar to one that's triggering you now, the visualization will trigger you now again, and that those emotions don't actually come from the past, but are being recreated simply by visualizing? Is it possible that your whole view of reality right now is a visualization anyway? That while we live in this seamlessly beautiful reality that we all agree exists, that the interpretation of reality causes the activation of inwardly facing triggers. Triggers that say, there's something wrong with me, that lead to not good enough, broken, abandoned. Is it possible that everybody has an abandonment trigger because when the child had their first fight or flight reaction, they went inward to self-assess, and that the overarching emotion of fear eliminated self-love, eliminated safety, creating this experience of being alone and abandoned? That when they looked at their parents in this state of fear, their parents improperly were imprinted upon in a state of confusion where the consciousness understanding the parents as the source of safety now interprets the parents as a source of danger. And this creates this figure it out, be good enough, I gotta be perfect for mom and dad, a vicious circle. And living a life within these vicious circles requires a future to live into. Is it true that you create a perfect future in your mind? A perfect future where you're happy, where you're healed, where you're successful, where you're loved, where you're wanted, where you're safe? And that in order to create that future, you put people in it, and those people have to be perfect with you in that future, and that you go into confusion to protect that future in order to avoid observing reality. You had to idealize that future person, and that anything that violates that ideal threatens your emotions because you are using that future to give yourself hope and happiness today. Hope and happiness that is eliminated by the stress and anxiety of living in a reactionary world where the thoughts and feelings of other people can define you automatically. Is it possible that these are not limiting beliefs, but the thoughts of not good enough are retroactive to describe the experience that you just got triggered into? Is it possible that what causes all human suffering has merely just been misunderstood? The first fight or flight reaction, defining all these triggers merely as experiential observations of what was missing from the anxiety and fear that was involuntary, as arbitrary as a smoke detector or a dog barking. What percentage of the smoke detector going off was actually a fire? What percentage of your dog barking at the Amazon guy is actually a threat? Why is it that you're 100% sure that you're not good enough then, when it's just a trigger?